right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our workshop 3 from our NLP workshop series. This is a re-recording. For those of you who tuned in on Twitch last time, you might have noticed that the Twitch recording crashed, so we'll be re-recording it right now in case anybody wants to have access to that recording when viewing our resources. So no need to check in because this is a re-recording. The outline for our notebook is effectively the same as previous NLP workshops. We have our setup and exploration section. We have our pre-processing section. We then build and train our model. This time we'll be adding an inference section just to analyze our data a little, or analyze our model outputs a little bit. And then we'll go ahead and conclude our workshop. So all of our resources by the time this video is posted should be available in our GitHub page, which we'll talk about later in the video. But for now, if you want to follow along, this link should be maintained and currently working. Okay, so before we start off with anything in this workshop, go ahead, go to Runtime, change runtime type, and make sure that your hardware accelerator is GPU. This will be important later on when we train our model so that it doesn't take forever to train. As for our contents, it's what I described before. We have our setup and exploration, pre-processing. We then build the model and look at our model architecture. We'll then train the model, do some inference, and finish up our workshop. Okay, so I'll pass it off to Jackie to do our setup and exploration section.
Hi everyone, so the data set we're going to be using is an English and French translation. So we're going to have our model translate from English to French. So you can download the data with this cell. And then we can import our libraries, and we're going to be using NumPy, TensorFlow, and Pandas. And then we can run the cell with our hyperparameters, which are basically things we can customize for our model and training. And so now we're getting ready to explore our data. So our data set is split into the short English sentences and their French translations. As you can see, there's also a citation section, but we're going to be ignoring that. And then now let's take like a little sample of our data. So we're going to only use the first 10,000 lines. So that's what you can see here after you run these cells. Okay, now let's get into pre-processing. So we're going to split up the data. So we split up the data into English, which is our input text, and French, which are our target texts. And then if you look at the figure, you can see that we're basically finding all unique characters in each of the texts and putting them into sets. So all the unique characters and input characters are going into the input text set. So let's move on to encoding and decoding now. So as you can see in the figure, the input text is put into the encoder. The encoder puts this input text into this context vector, which it passes to the decoder, and the decoder tries to translate the English into French, which is the output text. So we can create some variables related to these tokens, the length of the input characters and the length of target characters, for example, and then we can see what the longest English sentence is and what the longest French sentences with those last two variables. Now we can look at some stats about our data. So we can see what's the longest English sentence, what's the longest French, or how many characters are the longest English and French sentences, and how many unique tokens there are. Okay, so now let's prepare for encoding and decoding. So we're going to be mapping each character to an index with this cell, as you can see in the figure 2. And then we're going to be creating 3 arrays filled with zeros, and we're going to be filling this with vectors later in the rest of pre-processing. Okay, so now this is the bulk of the pre-processing. I'm not going to go into what all of this code does because it's pretty low level, but an example of like the first line you can see in the figure is that it basically maps each like pair input text and target text to a number. And so what this like whole code is doing is vectorizing our data. So after we run this cell, we vectorized our data. Now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is building our model.
Okay, great. Yeah, so now that we've preprocessed all of our text into a bunch of vectors, we can start building our model to take advantage of that text. So we're going to be using a sequence to sequence model. You guys saw a picture of what the overall model architecture looks like earlier on. The idea is that we have an encoder and a decoder. Now, to understand what an encoder and decoder are, first we're going to look at sort of the building blocks of our sequence to sequence model, and then we'll build our way up to the whole model architecture. So we're going to be using what's called an LSTM cell. LSTM cells stand for long short-term memory. This is what an LSTM cell looks like in its full unadulterated complicatedness, but this is more low level than we want to talk about here. So let's abstract one level to just three main gates. There's a forget gate, an input gate, and an output gate. The input gate takes some input and processes it in some way. The output gate will pass the output however it needs to, and the unique feature of an LSTM cell is what's called the forget gate. This forget gate allows us to forget unimportant information and remember important information. The motivation behind this lies in sort of how we think of memory. So the average person has a short-term memory and a long-term memory. Short-term memory helps us think about current tasks, and that's any information that's immediately important. Our long-term memory helps us remember important information from many, many years past in our life. Now, for long-term memory, we have some information that we want to remember throughout our lives. So for example, how to tie your shoes, how to fill a glass of water, so on and so forth. And there's some information that we don't want to remember. So for example, if I told you what the temperature is outside, that's cool and all, but we'll probably forget that within a day because we're not really going to be using that information in the long term. So the idea behind a forget gate is that it allows us to replicate these sorts of features of our own long-term memory, where we forget things that aren't super important, ignore stuff that's not super important, but then stuff that is important, we can remember throughout our entire model. Now, one thing to remember before we look further into LSTM cells is the setup of an RNN. If you were at our workshop 2, you might recall this diagram. So the way recurrent neural networks is that there's, let's say, n inputs. It'll take the first input, process it through its hidden layers, and then pass that as an output. And then for its second input, it will take the second input as well as some hidden state information from the previous input's hidden layers, combine all of that information, and then generate a second output, and so on and so forth. And as we talked before, one of the biggest features here is that, let's say you're processing a sentence and you're on your 10th word, you can remember the context of all previous 9 words when you're analyzing the 10th, which is important because things like sentences or videos, a lot of different data sets have data points that rely on the context of all previous data points or all other data points in the data set. So similarly, LSTMs can connect in this sort of recurrent way, where an LSTM will take in some previous state information, Cn-1, Hn-1, as well as the current input to create the current state information as well as the current output. To look at this in a sort of more detailed way, we have a decision tree for what each gate does. The input gate will take some previous hidden state information, and then it'll also take the current input. It'll accept all of this information to some varying degree and also choose to ignore some of it. Whatever it accepts goes straight to output gate, and then whatever gets it, in order to ignore some stuff, it'll pass that information off to the forget gate, which handles forgetting stuff. As for the forget gate, it'll take some previous hidden state information from the previous LSTM iteration, as well as some data from the input gate. Again, it'll combine this information, accept some of it to a varying degree, and forget some of it to a varying degree. Whatever it forgets gets passed on to later state information, and then whatever it remembers gets passed to our output gate. Finally, our output gate will take all of the data from the input gate and the forget gates, combine that in some way, and then pass that off as hidden state information as well as output for that iteration of the LSTM cell. So this is sort of a high-level overview of LSTM cells. There is a lot more important, but a lot more complicated information about them that you can explore more using this link, which goes through sort of each piece of an LSTM cell bit by bit. Now that we've created this LSTM cell and we sort of understand the idea behind it, we can start making our encoder and decoder. So our encoder will just be an input layer from Keras as well as an LSTM. And then the output of our encoder will be state H, state C, and our encoder outputs as pictured here. Now, for our context vector, we don't really care about the encoder inputs, which we'll talk about why later. But for our context vector, all of our information will be from state H and state C. The information held in state H and state C, which as we talked about before, is information about what the LSTM is remembering, forgetting, etc. All of this information can be packed into our context vector, and turns out that this is enough for our decoder to be able to start building the French sentence. So for building our decoder, our input will take in an input layer, and then we'll add an LSTM. In addition to our LSTM, we'll also add a dense layer, which is essentially a layer of neurons. Our decoder outputs also have some state information, but we're going to be ignoring that. In this case, we want the decoder outputs, which will effectively be our processed data. So again, our encoder architecture is just an LSTM with an input layer. And then our decoder architecture is an input layer with an LSTM, which then passes to a dense layer. An activation function is applied to that, in this case, softmax, and then that results in our final output. Okay, now abstracting one level further, our model is going to be our encoder and our decoder. So if you recall this image from before, we have input text, which is passed through the input layer for the decoder, or sorry, for the encoder. The encoder then does stuff through the LSTM to create the context vector through its hidden states. That context vector is passed off to the decoder, which takes it through an input layer, passes it to the LSTM, does some training, and then that's passed off to a dense layer, which creates our output text. Okay, now that we've built our model and we understand it on a sort of large level, we can start training. For training, we're going to have a batch size of 64 and a number of epochs of 100. If you want to mess with these numbers on your own, feel free. That should change sort of how your model compiles and trains. Now, before we start explaining how the training works, we're going to go ahead and run this cell. And after it takes a couple seconds to get started, we should notice that the epochs will take very little time to train, but give it a second. All right, so this is our first epoch. Probably took a little long, but for our second, third, fourth, etc., it's only taking about 2 seconds per epoch. Now, this might be kind of surprising because all of our previous models took longer to train, and yet those models were far less complicated. The reason here lies behind how exactly we're training. So to understand how we're training, first we have to understand how we're training our decoder. To train our decoder, we'll look at this article from Machine Learning Mastery, which talks about teacher forcing. So teacher forcing is a concept that's sort of based off of some shortcomings of traditional teaching in sort of training our model, which we'll discuss right here. So let's sort of take a step back from our own case, and let's talk about this example. Mary had a little lamb whose fleece was white as snow. Now, let's say we want to create a sort of sequence-to-sequence architecture, which has an encoder, which will take the English sentence and turn it into a context vector. And then we have a decoder, which will take that exact same context vector and turn it into the same sentence. So rather than translating from English to French, we're just taking a sentence, doing some processing, and then spitting out the exact same sentence. So let's look at this from a traditional sort of training perspective. Let's say we have our original sentence. This is turned into a context vector, and then our decoder wants to start reconstructing the sentence from scratch, word by word. So our decoder, assuming in this situation, doesn't have any knowledge, it hasn't been trained, so it's probably going to start spitting out garbage values. So for the first word, it'll spit out some garbage value, which is not super helpful. Then this will be passed off to the next iteration of our LSTM, which looks at the previous information and it sees a garbage value. Now, because it's basing its current processing off of a previous garbage value, the second word is also going to be garbage value. Same about the third, fourth, fifth, and eventually our decoder will create one whole sentence, which is just one big sentence of nothingness. What this effectively means is first, our decoder needs to learn how to create the first word. Then it can learn to create the second word. Then it can learn to create the third word, so on and so forth. This is very slow because it has to learn one word at a time, and learning one word at a time can take a while. So to fix this sort of length of training, we're going to be creating this concept called teacher forcing. Teacher forcing trains much in a similar sense. First, we'll create some initial word. It'll probably be some garbage value. What we're going to do now, before we go into the next iteration of the LSTM, is just throw away this output. We don't want it. This output is thrown away, and we replace that output with the ground truth for the next iteration. So this first word is Mary, which we know to be the first word in the sentence from our data set. Now, when processing the second word, the decoder will have the first word, which is the ground truth, and so it can start learning based off of some actual correct output. When we move on to the third word, we'll again throw away our output from previous cells and instead use the ground truth for the first two words. And then the third word can be trained off actual information, so on and so forth. What this means is that every single time that a decoder trains a word, it'll be based off of actual correct words, which means that we don't have to wait to train one word at a time. We can just train all of the words at once. As a result of teacher forcing, you can see that our model, which had 100 epochs, is already done in the time it took for that explanation. Looks like it took us about 3 minutes to train. Now, again, I would encourage you to look at this link and read through and try to understand a little bit better what teacher forcing is, but the idea for our model is effectively the same. The only difference is instead of going word by word, we're going character by character, and instead of reconstructing the same English sentence, we're converting that English sentence to French. Okay, so this is sort of the part of our workshop where most of the information we wanted you guys to remember has been said. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've gone over. First, we went over set up an exploration where we set up our data by downloading it and looked at our data set. We then pre-processed the data, which was effectively vectorizing all of the words so that we could use in our model. We then built our model, which was based off of the LSTM cell. That LSTM cell allowed us to make an encoder and a decoder, which we then hooked together to create the overall model architecture. Finally, we started training our model primarily by looking how we train the decoder, and we train the decoder using teacher forcing to make sure each epoch takes as little time as possible. Okay, now that we've gone over all this information, we're going to go over inference. Again, the code here is fairly complicated and is probably beyond the scope of this workshop, but effectively, we want you guys to we want to introduce all of you to inference so that you understand what it is, and if it comes up again in later training, you know what to do with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to rip apart our model into two main parts, the encoder and the decoder. That's essentially what this code does. What we'll then do is we'll create another dictionary to sort of reverse our previous dictionary for the mapping of each character. We then take all of these variables to create this decode sequence function. What this decode sequence function does is it effectively makes the model we trained usable in a real context. So for example, let's say we pass some input sequence. It'll take that input sequence and it'll use our model to predict what output sequence it should have for the states. That's then passed off to our decoder, which we wrote out previously, and then that decoder will pass out a decoded sentence. What this means is that we can actually use our model to train English sentences. Now, to perform actual inference, we have this function sequence index. What we're doing is we're creating a set of random indices from our data set, so anything from 0 to 1,000. In this case, we have 10 numbers from 0 to 1,000. We'll then get the actual English sentence from our data set, pass this into our decode sequence function, and then compare it to the actual decoded sentence. Let's go ahead and run this to see the output. Oh, sorry, I did not run the previous cell. Okay. All right, so one by one, we'll be looking at different sentences. So we have draw a circle, which is tracer un cercle, which is very close to our original translation. We have do I look fat, which has the exact same translation. And then there are some which have the same meaning, but are a different translation. And there are also some where the translations aren't exactly right. So one thing to note is that if you know French, you'll know that some of these conjugations are very specific. So this is for a plural conjugation, whereas the database had a singular conjugation. What this means is our model is choosing one specific type of conjugation and using that to translate a specific sentence, which can be good in a sense because you want the same output from your model each time you put in an input, but it's also bad because French has different conjugations and it depends on the context. And you can also do this on a much larger set of sentences. You can do this on more of the data set. You can look at two sentences and how they're translated in different ways, so on and so forth. But effectively what inference lets you do is look at the data, apply your model to the data, and then look at that subset of applied data to see effectively what your model is doing, what bugs your model might have, what unique quirks your model might have, and what unintended positives your model might have. So to conclude, let's sort of recap everything we did. First, we downloaded and imported our libraries, took a look at the data. We then chopped it down to only 10,000 elements, mainly because of Colab's RAM limitations. We pre-processed our data into a three-dimensional array. That array was then used to train our model. Our model was built on a sequence-to-sequence architecture, which had an encoder and a decoder. In this case, we're using an LSTM. We trained our model, and then we ran inference on it. Okay, so with that is sort of the end of our 3-workshop NLP series. These are all of the links that are relevant for our series. These are all links that you saw in previous workshops. That being said, by the time that this video is uploaded, the GitHub should already be up with all of our resources available. So everything you see here will be in that GitHub, along with a README sort of explaining each workshop at a higher level. We encourage you to look at the GitHub because this will be maintained. Some of these links may end up breaking sometime in the future. All of the workshops are available. All of the videos will be linked as they get uploaded to our YouTube, so on and so forth. So you can use this link to access all of the resources in the future, especially if you started attending maybe the 2nd workshop or 3rd, but maybe didn't see a previous workshop, so on and so forth. We highly encourage you to go back and start looking at previous workshops, especially if these later workshops were a little bit too in-depth or a little bit too complicated, because they offer a solid foundation to start understanding the later workshops. In addition to that, if you have some more interest in NLP, UCSD has a lot of courses that you can take. There are a couple here, CSE 156, 291, etc. One thing to note is that for the CSE courses, a lot of these are for CS majors only. So if you're like a data science or math or any other major, you may not be able to take them. In that case, instead of taking, for example, 156, you can take the grad level version, 256. The seats here are very limited and the courses themselves are harder because they're grad level courses. But if you have an interest in taking these courses and you're up for the challenge, you can always ask the professor to let you take the course and then take the course that way. There's also other alternatives in other majors that are open to more people. Finally, if you don't necessarily have some of the prerequisites yet, or maybe you don't have many courses left before you graduate, whatever the situation might be, there's also a lot of self-learning courses out there. Stanford has most of their sort of CS courses available online. For this one, you can look at 224N. Their lectures are all available on their YouTube, and then all of their lecture materials and assignments and quizzes and all that stuff are available online. There's also an NLP specialization on Coursera if you want a little bit more structure to look at more assignments, etc. Point is, NLP is something that anybody can start at with any level of understanding of NLP or AI or whatever. There's a lot of courses available at UCSD, but if not, there's a lot of tools available online for anybody to learn NLP and to start getting used to it. But yeah, that concludes our workshop series, our entire workshop series, as well as workshop number 3. If you have any questions, feel free to ping us on our ACMAI Discord. Everybody in the board is more than willing to answer any questions. And that'll be all. Thank you.
Thank you.